For the elite of New York City, Jareth Hallberg III's annual Gilded Gala was not just a party, it was a theater of power. It was where fortunes were flaunted, alliances were forged, and reputations were made or broken under the light of colossal crystal chandeliers. Tonight, amidst the flow of vintage champagne and the murmur of billion-dollar deals, a different kind of drama was about to unfold. The star of this cruel play wasn't a socialite or a CEO, but a 24-year-old waitress named Lysandra Whitlow, a girl with tired eyes and a past she kept buried like a secret treasure. And the director of her demise was the host himself, a man who believed money could buy anything, including the satisfaction of shattering a person's soul. He was about to command a waitress to perform, not for their entertainment, but for her public humiliation. The air in the Hallberg penthouse, a sprawling glass kingdom perched atop one of Manhattan's most expensive spires of architecture, was thick with the scent of money. It was a complex fragrance, a blend of rare orchids, French perfume, aged leather, and the subtle metallic tang of ambition. Lysandra Whitlow had been breathing it in for 6 hours, and it was starting to suffocate her. Her uniform, a crisp black dress, starched white apron, and sensible but agonizing shoes, felt like a costume for a role she never auditioned for. The Invisible Girl. Her job was to glide through the throngs of silk and diamonds, a phantom armed with a silver tray of champagne flutes or delicate canapes, her face a mask of pleasant neutrality. She was to see everything and be seen by no one. Tonight was worse than usual. Jareth Hallberg III, the heir to a logistics and private equity empire, hosted this gala annually. He was a man sculpted from privilege, with a jawline as sharp as his business tactics and eyes the color of a winter sky, cold, clear, and vast. He moved through his party like a predator in his natural habitat, his laughter a sharp bark that made people flinch even as they smiled. Lysandra had served him twice tonight, and each time his gaze had slid over her with an unnerving flicker of something more than casual disregard. It felt specific. Lysandra's life was a world away from this opulent cage. Her reality was a cramped fourth-floor walk-up in Queens, the constant hum of a nebulizer for her mother's failing lungs, and a stack of bills that grew faster than the weeds in their neglected window box. The piano in their small living room, a worn-out Baldwin upright that had been her father's pride, was her only sanctuary. Its keys, yellowed like old teeth, were silent these days. There was no time for music. Music was a luxury, a ghost of a life she had been forced to abandon. 5 years ago, she wasn't Lysandra Whitlow, waitress. She was Helena Whitlow, the prodigy of the Juilliard pre-college division. The girl whose fingers could coax thunderstorms and whispers from a concert grand. Her mentor, the legendary Professor Andrei Markov, had called her his little Rachmaninoff. He believed she had a divine spark, but that spark had been extinguished in the harsh floodlights of the Van Cliburn International Piano Competition. She was 19. The pressure, the weight of her dying father's hopes, the sea of expectant faces, it had all crashed down on her in the middle of Chopin's Fourth Ballade. Her mind went blank. Her fingers, usually so confident and fluid, froze over the keys, turning to lead. The silence that followed was louder than any wrong note she could have played. It was the sound of her future imploding. She fled the stage, and she never went back. Professor Markov passed away a month later from a heart attack, and Lysandra's father followed 6 months after that, leaving her with his medical debts and her asthmatic mother. The grand piano on the world stage was replaced by a silver tray in a rich man's penthouse. A sharp clatter pulled her from her reverie. One of the other waitstaff, a nervous boy named Tim, had dropped a tray of glasses. Jareth Hallberg, who was standing nearby with a woman draped in emeralds, turned his head slowly. The smile on his face didn't falter, but his eyes turned to ice. "Clean that up," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a command that could end a career. He then looked directly past the terrified boy, his eyes landing squarely on Lysandra. He held her gaze for a moment, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his lips. It was the same look from earlier, but now it was filled with a chilling sense of purpose. He knew something, and in the gilded cage of the Hallberg penthouse, to be truly seen was the most dangerous thing of all. The party throbbed around Lysandra like a living organism. The professional pianist, a man with a bored expression and flawless technique, had been playing sanitized versions of Debussy and Satie for hours, his music a pleasant but forgettable wallpaper. Lysandra continued her rounds, the weight of Halberg's gaze feeling like a physical presence on her back. She tried to dismiss it as paranoia, a side effect of fatigue and old anxieties bubbling to the surface. Then a subtle shift occurred in the room's energy. A hushed conversation started near the grand piano. A magnificent Fazioli, its black lacquer gleaming like a pool of oil under the spotlights. Mr. Dubois, the catering manager and Lysandra's boss, was speaking in urgent, low tones to Halberg's personal assistant. Dubois' face was pale, his brow furrowed with stress. Lysandra, refilling glasses nearby, couldn't help but overhear fragments. Sudden migraine. Can't see straight. His agent is terribly sorry. The pianist was packing up his sheet music, his face a mask of feigned agony, as he was discreetly escorted out by a member of the security team. The music stopped. For the first time all night, an awkward silence began to stretch across the vast room, broken only by the murmur of confused guests. Jareth Halberg materialized at the center of the void, a champagne flute in his hand. He exuded an aura of complete control, as if this disruption was merely a planned intermission in his grand production. "My dear friends," he announced, his voice effortlessly commanding attention, "a minor technical difficulty. It seems our musician for the evening has been struck by a rather dramatic and ill-timed malady." A ripple of polite, disappointed laughter went through the crowd. Penelope Monroe, the woman in emeralds who clung to Halberg's arm, pouted theatrically. "Oh, Johnny, what a bore! I was so enjoying the ambiance." "Fear not, my dear," Halberg said, his eyes scanning the room. They passed over senators, tech billionaires, and art dealers, finally landing, with surgical precision, on Lysandra. She froze, her hand hovering over a bottle of Perrier-Jouet. "I believe," Halberg continued, a cruel smirk playing on his lips, "we may have a replacement right here among us." He took a deliberate step towards her. The sea of guests parted, turning to follow his gaze. Suddenly, Lysandra was no longer invisible. She was on a stage. The spotlights were the collective stare of 200 of the most powerful people in New York, and the silence was the same suffocating void she remembered from the competition. "This young lady," Halberg said, gesturing towards her with his flute, "does more than just serve our drinks. She has a hidden talent." Mr. Dubois rushed forward, his face slick with sweat. "Mr. Halberg, sir, I do apologize for the inconvenience with the pianist, but my staff are here only to—" Halberg cut him off with a lazy wave of his hand, never taking his eyes off Lysandra. "Dubois, relax. I'm giving your employee a promotion, from waitress to concert pianist for the evening." He turned back to the crowd. "You see, I have an excellent memory for faces and for failures. I believe the last time I saw you, you were on a stage in Fort Worth, Texas. The Van Cliburn competition, wasn't it?" A collective gasp, quiet but sharp, rippled through the onlookers. Lysandra's blood ran cold. He remembered. He had been there. He had seen her choke, her career die before it had ever truly begun. "Helena Whitlow," he said, savoring the name. "The Juilliard prodigy who couldn't handle the pressure. Tell me, do your fingers still work? Or did they freeze up permanently along with your promising future?" The words were stones, each one striking her with brutal accuracy. This wasn't a spontaneous whim. This was a premeditated execution. The pianist's sudden migraine felt less like a coincidence and more like a carefully orchestrated move in a sadistic game. He hadn't just recognized her. He had planned this. Penelope Monroe giggled, a high, piercing sound. "Oh, Johnny, you're dreadful, making the help perform like a circus animal." "Nonsense," Halberg said smoothly, his smile widening. "I'm offering her a chance to redeem herself in front of a much more influential audience. I'll even be generous. I'll pay you $5,000 if you can play one piece without running off the stage in tears." He pulled out a slim, platinum money clip, peeling off a stack of $100 bills. He fanned them out, holding them towards her. "What do you say, Helena? A little tune for your supper?" The humiliation was absolute, a physical force that pressed the air from her lungs. She could feel the pity, the morbid curiosity, the disdain from the crowd. She looked at her boss, Mr. Dubois, who simply stared at his shoes, unwilling to meet her eyes or challenge his powerful client. She was utterly, completely alone, trapped. That was the only word for it. Lysandra stood in the center of the silent room, the focus of 100 pairs of eyes. Halberg's offer of $5,000 hung in the air, a grotesque parody of patronage. It wasn't a payment. It was a price tag on her dignity. He wasn't asking her to play the piano. He was asking her to perform her own failure, to reenact her greatest shame for his amusement. Her mind was a maelstrom of conflicting impulses. One voice screamed at her to run. Flee the penthouse, the city, this life. Shed this skin of servitude and shame, and disappear. Another, smaller voice, brittle with pride, urged her to throw the tray of drinks in his perfectly handsome, smug face. But then the image of her mother, frail and wheezing in their small apartment, flashed in her mind. The cost of a new oxygen concentrator, the overdue rent notice tucked behind the kitchen clock. $5,000 was more than she made in 3 months. It was a lifeline. But the cost of it, the cost was her soul. Halberg was enjoying her paralysis. He thrived on this kind of power, the kind that stripped a person down to their most desperate choices. Come now, he taunted, his voice dripping with false encouragement. Don't be shy, it's a fazioli. I doubt you've touched anything so fine in years. Consider it a gift. He saw her as a broken thing, a failed prodigy who now refilled glasses for a living. To him, her talent was a fossil, a relic of a past she had proven unworthy of. And he wanted to dig it up, display it, and watch it crumble to dust under the pressure of his manufactured stage. It was then that a different memory pierced through the fog of her fear and humiliation. It was the voice of Professor Markov, his Russian accent thick and warm, in his cluttered studio at Juilliard. He was sitting beside her at the piano after a frustrating practice session where she had let her nerves get the better of her. Helena, moya zvezdochka, he had said, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. They will try to make the music about them, about the critics, the money, the applause. But the music is not for them. It is never for them. It is the language of God. It is the truth you carry inside you. When you sit at the piano, you are not performing. You are testifying. You play for the music itself, for the composer who bled his soul onto the page. You play for every person who needs to hear that truth, and you play for yourself. Remember that, always. Testify. The word echoed in her mind, a clarion call from the past. For 5 years she had been silent. She had let the shame of one failure define the entirety of her being. She had dishonored her gift, dishonored her father's sacrifices, dishonored Professor Markov's belief in her. She had let men like Jareth Halberg write her story. A slow, burning anger began to replace the cold dread in her stomach. It was an anger born of grief and regret, a righteous fury against the injustice of her situation. He wanted to see her break. He wanted a show. He would get one, but it wouldn't be the one he was expecting. She looked from Halberg's mocking face to the magnificent Fazioli piano. It sat there, patient and powerful, a vessel of untold stories. It wasn't a prop in his cruel theater. It was a lifeline back to who she was. Lysandra drew in a sharp, steadying breath. She met Jareth Halberg's gaze, and for the first time, her own held no fear. It held a chilling, resolute calm. "Keep your money," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the silence of the vast room. She then turned to a nearby service table, carefully placing her silver tray down with a soft, definitive click. She unfastened the crisp white apron, folded it neatly, and laid it on top of the tray. It was a small act, but it was a declaration. She was no longer the waitress. Without another glance at Halberg or the stunned crowd, she began to walk towards the piano. The walk from the service station to the Fazioli grand piano was only 30 feet, but for Lysandra, it was the longest journey of her life. Each step was a battle. Her worn-out, sensible shoes made almost no sound on the plush, cream-colored carpet. Yet in the cathedral-like silence of the penthouse, every footfall seemed to echo like a drumbeat. The air was electric with anticipation. The guests, moments before a chattering monolith of wealth, were now a gallery of individual expressions. Lysandra could feel their eyes on her, dissecting her. She saw the sneering pity on Penelope Monroe's face, the morbid curiosity of the tech billionaires, the detached amusement of the seasoned socialites who had seen it all and were hungry for a new spectacle. Her own body was a traitor. Her palms were slick with sweat. A tremor started in her hands, the same terrible tremor that had preceded her collapse at the Van Cliburn. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner begging for escape. The ghosts of her past swirled around her, whispering doubts in her ear. "You're not good enough. You're going to fail again. They're all waiting for you to fall apart." Hallberg's smirk was a physical blow from across the room. He had folded his arms, leaning back with the casual arrogance of a Roman emperor about to watch a gladiator be fed to the lions. He believed he had already won. He had stripped her of her uniform, isolated her, and put her on display. What more could there be? But as she drew closer to the piano, another set of memories began to surface, pushing back against the tide of fear. She remembered her father, a taxi driver with calloused hands, working double shifts for a decade to pay for her first real piano. The old Baldwin. She remembered the look on his face, a mixture of exhaustion and pure, unadulterated joy as he watched her play for the first time. She remembered Professor Markov, his booming laugh filling the practice hall as she finally mastered a particularly difficult passage of Liszt. He never focused on her mistakes, only on the passion she brought to the music. "Technique is a tool, Helena," he'd say, "but the heart is the musician." These were the people she had played for. This was the legacy she had abandoned. She reached the piano. It was even more beautiful up close. The lacquer was so deep it seemed you could fall into it. The Fazioli insignia was inlaid in mother of pearl, a quiet statement of its magnificent pedigree. The bench was upholstered in rich black leather. It was an instrument built for a master, an altar for the gods of music. For 5 years she had felt unworthy of even touching an instrument like this. Tonight she realized she wasn't just playing for her own soul, but for the soul of the music itself, which deserved to be heard without mockery or contempt. She sat down on the bench. The leather was cool and smooth. She took a moment, adjusting the height, a small professional ritual that seemed to anchor her in the swirling chaos of the room. She looked down at the keys. 88 silent promises. They were not instruments of her torture. They were extensions of her voice, a voice she had kept silent for far too long. She placed her hands just above the keyboard, her fingers hovering, the tremor still present, but now different. It was no longer the shaking of fear. It was the vibration of a string pulled taut, humming with potential energy, waiting for the release. She closed her eyes, shutting out the faces, the penthouse, the city. She shut out Jareth Hallberg. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she was back in Professor Markov's studio. The smell of old books, lemon polish, and his ever-present cup of black tea filled her senses. She could hear his voice, a low, comforting rumble. "Testify, moja zvezdochka. Testify." Her eyes opened. They were clear and focused. She looked straight ahead, not at the audience, but through them, towards a horizon only she could see. Her hands, now steady, descended. And then she began to play. The first note that Lysandra played was not loud or dramatic. It was a single questioning C, the opening of Frédéric Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It fell into the silent room with the weight of a stone dropped into a deep well, the ripples spreading out in ever-widening circles. The note was hesitant, filled with a profound sorrow, as if the piano itself was sighing. A few guests shifted impatiently. Hallberg's smirk remained fixed. This was what he expected, a timid, broken melody from a broken girl. Penelope let out a barely audible scoff. But then the second phrase answered the first, a little stronger, a little more insistent. The tempo was slow, achingly so. Lysandra was not rushing. She was telling a story. The introduction was a lament, a musical narration of her 5 lost years, the quiet grief, the numbing routine, the deferred dreams. Each note was imbued with a weight of emotion that the previous pianist's sterile performance had utterly lacked. As the waltz-like theme began, A change started to happen in the room. The initial smirks and whispers faded. People leaned forward, their expressions shifting from curiosity to intrigue. The music was pulling them in. Lysandra's playing was technically perfect, yes, but it was more than that. It was raw, honest, and deeply personal. She wasn't just playing notes, she was bearing her soul. The piece began to build. The left-hand arpeggios, which can sound muddy in amateur hands, were a clear, rushing river beneath the soaring melody of the right. Her hands, which had once served champagne, now danced across the keys with an impossible combination of power and grace. The hesitant girl was gone. In her place was an artist, a master in complete command of her instrument. Jareth Halberg's smile had vanished. His arms were no longer folded. He stood rigid, his champagne flute held forgotten in his hand. He was no musical expert, but even he could recognize the chasm between a hired entertainer and a true virtuoso. The timid waitress he had intended to humiliate was transforming before his eyes into something powerful, something he couldn't control. The quiet lament was becoming a declaration. The first thunderous scherzo section erupted from the piano. It was a storm of passion and fury. Lysandra's body swayed with the music, her entire being poured into the performance. The sound filled the cavernous penthouse, vibrating through the floor, through the crystal glasses, through the very bones of everyone present. This was the anger she had suppressed for years, at her fate, at the world, at herself. It was the sound of a cage rattling, its bars beginning to break. In the crowd, an elderly woman with intelligent eyes and a simple but elegant pearl necklace, Mrs. Beatrice Ainsworth, a long-standing patron of the New York Philharmonic, closed her eyes, a look of stunned reverence on her face. She was not just hearing a beautiful piece of music, she was witnessing a resurrection. The piece transitioned into the lyrical E-flat major section, a moment of breathtaking beauty and hope. Lysandra's touch softened, each note a pearl of crystalline clarity. It was a memory of love, of Professor Markov's kindness, of her father's pride. Tears began to well in her eyes, but they did not stop her. They mingled with her testimony, adding a layer of heartbreaking vulnerability to the music's beauty. And then came the finale, the presto con fuoco, fast with fire. What Lysandra unleashed upon the Fazioli was not just music, it was a conflagration. Her fingers became a blur, a force of nature flying across the keyboard in a torrent of sound. The coda of Ballade No. 1 is one of the most technically demanding passages in the solo piano repertoire. A furious, desperate, and ultimately triumphant cascade of notes. She played it with a ferocity that was terrifying and exhilarating. It was the sound of her breaking free from her past, burning the shame and fear to ashes with every perfectly executed scale and earth-shaking chord. The final chords rang out, a series of titanic blows that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building, and then silence. A profound, absolute silence that was more deafening than the music that had preceded it. Lysandra's hands fell from the keyboard into her lap. Her chest was heaving, sweat beading on her forehead. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sadness or humiliation. They were tears of release, of catharsis, of reclamation. She had testified. The silence that followed the final chord was a sacred thing. No one moved, no one breathed. The guests who had come for cocktails and empty chatter had been unwillingly baptized in an ocean of pure emotion. They had expected a spectacle of failure, and had instead witnessed a miracle of artistry. They had seen a waitress become a titan. The first to break the stillness was Beatrice Ainsworth. The elderly woman rose slowly to her feet, her hands adorned with understated rings, coming together in a firm, deliberate clap. The sound was like a single stone starting an avalanche. Suddenly, the room erupted. It wasn't polite society applause. It was a roar, a standing ovation that was visceral and immediate. Shouts of "Bravo!" echoed off the high ceilings. People who wouldn't give a waitress a second glance were on their feet, their faces alight with an awe and respect that was entirely genuine. They weren't applauding the help. They were honoring an artist who had just given them a piece of her soul. Lysandra sat at the piano, blinking through her tears, the wave of sound washing over her. It was so different from the silence that had crushed her 5 years ago. This was not the validation she had once craved, but something deeper, a shared human experience. She had spoken her truth, and they had heard her. Across the room, Jareth Hallberg stood frozen amidst the adulation, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent fury. The centerpiece of his party, the master of his universe, had been upstaged. His cruel game had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. He hadn't broken her. He had unleashed her. The waitress he intended to make a fool of was now the queen of the room, and he was nothing more than a vulgar court jester in $1,000 suit. He tried to reclaim the narrative. "Well, well," he shouted over the applause, forcing a laugh that sounded like grinding glass. "Quite the dramatic little party trick. Let's have a hand for the entertainment." But his words were lost, swallowed by the genuine fervor of the crowd. No one was looking at him. All eyes were on Lysandra. He had lost control of his own party, of his own guests. His power, which he wielded like a weapon, had proven useless against the power of true talent. Lysandra finally rose from the piano bench, her legs unsteady. She gave a small, shaky bow, a gesture of gratitude not to the audience, but to the music, to the piano. As she turned, she found Beatrice Ainsworth standing before her, her kind eyes shining. "My dear child," Mrs. Ainsworth said, her voice warm and steady, easily cutting through the din. "That was not a performance. That was a testimony." She used the exact word Professor Markov had used, and the coincidence struck Lysandra with the force of a physical blow. "I haven't heard Chopin played with such honesty and passion in 30 years, not since I heard Rubinstein himself." The comparison was so staggering that Lysandra could only stare, speechless. Mrs. Ainsworth reached into her clutch and produced a simple, elegant business card. "My name is Beatrice Ainsworth. I am on the board of the New York Philharmonic. This is my private number. I want you to call me tomorrow. A gift like yours does not belong on a serving tray." Lysandra took the card, her trembling fingers brushing against the older woman's. The thick, embossed cardstock felt like the heaviest, most substantial thing she had ever held. It was a key, a chance. Her gaze then drifted past Mrs. Ainsworth to her boss, Mr. Dubois, who was hovering nearby, his face a comical mixture of shock and terror. He looked at Lysandra as if seeing her for the first time. Lysandra walked over to him, her steps now firm and confident. She looked him directly in the eye. "Mr. Dubois," she said, her voice no longer quiet, but ringing with newfound strength. "I quit." She didn't wait for a response. She turned him without a backward glance at the chaos of the party, at the stunned faces of the guests, or at the impotent rage contorting Jareth Hallberg's features. She walked toward the service exit. She was leaving the gilded cage, not as a disgraced waitress, but as the artist she was always meant to be. The door swung shut behind her, leaving the world of empty wealth and calculated cruelty behind as she stepped out into the cool night air of a city full of new possibilities. The days following the gala were a surreal blur for Lysandra. She woke up in her cramped Queen's apartment expecting to feel the familiar dread of putting on her uniform, but instead she felt a quiet, burgeoning hope. Beatrice Ainsworth's business card sat on the small table beside her mother's bed like a holy relic. For 2 days she just looked at it, terrified that the magic of that night would dissipate if she tried to grasp it. Her mother, whose breathing seemed a little easier since Lysandra had told her the story, finally patted her hand and said, "The world doesn't reward those who wait for permission, my love. Call her." With her mother's encouragement, Lysandra made the call. Beatrice Ainsworth answered on the second ring, her voice as warm and reassuring as it had been in the penthouse. She didn't offer platitudes. She offered a plan. She arranged for a private audition with Maestro Gustavo Serrano, the famously demanding conductor of the Philharmonic. She spoke of the Ainsworth Fellowship for Emerging Artists, a fund she personally managed, which could cover Lysandra's living expenses, allowing her to practice full-time and ensure her mother received the best medical care. It was a complete systemic rescue from the life that had been slowly crushing her. Meanwhile, Jareth Hallberg III was discovering that the ripples from the stone he had thrown were turning into a tsunami that threatened to drown him. He had severely miscalculated the nature of his own social circle. While they reveled in gossip and schadenfreude, they were also fiercely protective of their own cultural authority. They were patrons of the arts, board members of museums, and funders of orchestras. To them, art was a sacred commodity, a mark of true class that money alone couldn't buy. Hallberg's actions were not seen as a clever power play, but as a vulgar display of new money barbarism. He hadn't just tried to humiliate a waitress. He had shown profound disrespect for the institution of music itself. He had used a Fazioli grand piano as a prop for a cruel joke, and in doing so, had exposed his own cultural bankruptcy. The story spread like wildfire through the elite circles of New York, then to the wider world via social media posts from awestruck guests. The narrative was irresistible: the billionaire bully and the hidden genius. Hallberg was cast as the villain, a modern-day Salieri consumed by a petty desire to destroy a Mozart he couldn't understand. The consequences were swift and brutal. An older, more established venture capitalist he was courting for a major tech merger pulled out of the deal, citing a fundamental misalignment of values. A coveted invitation to join the board of the Metropolitan Museum of Art was quietly rescinded. Old money families who had tolerated his brashness for the sake of his fortune now snubbed him at restaurants. Penelope Monroe, seeing his social stock plummet, abruptly ended their relationship, releasing a statement through her publicist about her commitment to supporting the arts and empowering women. His empire, built on a foundation of ruthless intimidation, was beginning to show cracks. The story had humanized his balance sheets, and his brand was now tainted with a reputation for cruelty. He was becoming a liability. His own father, Jareth Hallberg II, a man who cared for little beyond the family name and its continued profitability, summoned him for a meeting. It was not a conversation, it was a condemnation. He was publicly censured and quietly stripped of his role in overseeing the family's philanthropic endeavors. The ultimate humiliation. But the worst was yet to come. As Beatrice Ainsworth began to formally sponsor Lysandra, her team of lawyers and investigators started looking into the events of that night. They discovered something far more sinister than a spontaneous act of cruelty. The pianist, who had conveniently developed a migraine, had received an anonymous payment of $25,000 to his offshore account that very afternoon. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a conspiracy. Jareth Hallberg hadn't just stumbled upon an opportunity to be cruel. He had meticulously set a trap. He had known exactly who Lysandra was all along, and he had orchestrated the entire evening with the sole purpose of destroying her for a second time. The question was no longer just what he did, but why he harbored such a deep-seated, personal vendetta against her. The answer, they would soon discover, was buried in the past, in a rejection he had never forgiven. Beatrice Ainsworth sat opposite Lysandra in the sun-drenched sitting room of her Upper East Side brownstone. The space was the antithesis of Hallberg's penthouse, filled not with sterile modern art, but with books, history, and the quiet comfort of old-world elegance. A week had passed since Lysandra's triumphant audition with Maestro Serrano, who had been so moved he'd offered her a soloist position for the upcoming spring season. It was a fairy tale, yet Lysandra was still haunted by a question. Why? Lysandra asked, her teacup resting untouched in her saucer. Why would he go to such lengths? To pay off the pianist? To plan the whole thing? He saw me fail once. Why did he need to see it again so badly? Beatrice's expression was somber. My people have been looking into it, she said gently. The Hallbergs have a long history of arts patronage, but it's of a particular kind. They don't support artists. They try to own them. They see talent as another asset to be acquired. And it seems Jareth Hallberg III tried to acquire you once before. She slid a file across the antique mahogany table. Lysandra opened it. Inside were copies of correspondence dating back 6 years, when she was 18 and the brightest star at Juilliard. They were letters from the Hallberg Foundation addressed to her mentor, Professor Andrei Markov. The letters outlined a proposal for the Hallberg Prize, a full, all-expenses-paid scholarship that would have funded Lysandra's entire education, her competition fees, her housing, and provided a generous stipend. It would have meant no more financial struggles for her or her father. On the surface, it was an incredible act of philanthropy. But as Lysandra read on, she saw the strings. The contract stipulated that the Hallberg Foundation would have exclusive rights to her first 3 professional recordings, final say on her competition repertoire, and that she would be required to perform at a minimum of 10 private Hallberg corporate events per year. She would have been their in-house genius, a cultural showpiece to impress their clients. Then she saw Professor Markov's reply. It was a masterclass in polite, but firm, refusal. "Dear Mr. Hallberg," he had written, "while I thank you for your generous offer on behalf of Miss Whitlow, I must respectfully decline. Helena's gift is not a commodity to be managed by a board of directors. Her musical soul must be allowed to develop freely, without the constraints of commercial or corporate obligation. She is an artist, not an asset. To bind her to such a contract would be to cage a nightingale. We will continue to manage through more modest means. Sincerely, Professor A. Markov." Lysandra's breath hitched. She had never known about this. Professor Markov and her father had protected her from it, not wanting to burden her with the choice between artistic freedom and financial security. They had made the choice for her, the right choice. Hallberg took the rejection as a personal insult, Beatrice explained. He saw Markov as an arrogant academic, and you as an ungrateful girl who didn't know her place. In his mind, he offered you the world, and you and your mentor spat in his face. When he saw you years later, working as a waitress at his party, it must have felt like the ultimate vindication to him. He saw the caged nightingale serving drinks. He thought fate had proven him right. It all clicked into place. The cruelty wasn't random. It was the festering wound of a narcissist's ego. He didn't just want to see her fail again. He wanted to prove to himself, and to the ghost of Professor Markov, that he had been right all along, that without his money, her talent was worthless. He wanted to break her to validate his own twisted worldview, where everything and everyone has a price. So when he offered me the $5,000 to play, Lysandra trailed off, the full weight of the insult landing on her. "He was offering you a new contract," Beatrice finished, her eyes flashing with anger. "A much cheaper one this time. A one-night lease on your soul. He needed you to take the money. He needed you to play badly. He needed you to be the broken thing he always believed you would become without him." Lysandra closed the file. The knowledge was horrifying, but it was also liberating. The phantom that had haunted her for 5 years wasn't just an abstract fear of failure. It had a name and a face. And she hadn't just beaten him, she had refuted his entire philosophy of life. Her performance wasn't just a comeback, it was a tribute to Professor Markov's wisdom and a definitive statement that her gift was not and would never be for sale. "He wanted to own my failure," Lysandra whispered, a steely resolve hardening her voice. "Instead, he's going to have to watch my success." Beatrice Ainsworth smiled, a true, brilliant smile. "And we, my dear, are going to give him a front row seat." The backstage air of Carnegie Hall was a living entity, thick with the ghosts of a century of legendary performances. It smelled of aged wood, rosin, velvet dust, and the faint, electric tang of ozone from the stage lights. For any musician, it was hallowed ground. For Lysandra Whitlow, standing in the wings in a simple, elegant, midnight blue gown, it was the final station on a pilgrimage from the abyss. 6 months had passed since the night at the Hallberg penthouse. They were months of rediscovery, of grueling but joyous work that felt less like practice and more like remembering how to breathe. Under the meticulous guidance of Maestro Gustavo Serrano and the unwavering maternal support of Beatrice Ainsworth, Lysandra had not just reclaimed her formidable technique, she had forged a new, unbreakable artistic identity. The Ainsworth Fellowship had been a miracle, providing not only for her own needs, but for the specialized medical care that had seen her mother's health improve beyond their most optimistic prayers. The constant wheeze that had been the soundtrack to Lysandra's anxiety was now replaced by the sound of her mother's quiet, steady breathing, a peace that echoed in Lysandra's own soul. Tonight's piece was a declaration, Sergei Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. A composition of staggering beauty and difficulty, it was famous for being the work that pulled the composer himself from a 3-year spiral of depression and creative paralysis. It was a monument to resilience, a story of a journey from crushing despair to blazing, unequivocal triumph. It was Lysandra's own story, written in the universal language of music. Maestro Serrano, a man whose fiery passion was tempered by a deep, scholarly reverence for the music, approached her. His usual stern expression was softened by a look of profound respect. "Helena," he said, his voice a low rumble, "out there is not a jury. It is not an audience of critics. It is a hall full of people who are hungry for truth. Just tell your story. The orchestra and I are simply here to help you tell it." She met his intense gaze and gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Maestro, for everything." The fear that had once been her constant companion, the cold, coiling serpent of stage fright, was gone. In its place was a focused, humming energy, a powerful calm. She was no longer the terrified girl from the Van Cliburn competition, desperate for approval. She was a woman who had walked through fire and knew, with absolute certainty, who she was. The stage manager gave the final call. Lysandra took one last deep breath and walked out of the wings into the warm, golden bath of the stage lights. The applause that greeted her was a physical wave of warmth and welcome. The story of the waitress and the billionaire had become a quiet legend in the city's cultural circles, and the hall was sold out, filled with a palpable sense of anticipation. She bowed with a grace that felt both humble and regal, her eyes sweeping across the vast, tiered expanse of the hall. She saw Beatrice in the patron's box, her hands clasped, her face a portrait of pride. And then, several rows back in the orchestra section, she saw him. Jareth Hallberg III. He looked smaller here, diminished, a gray figure in a sea of color. The arrogant gleam in his eyes had been replaced by a haunted, hollow look. His public shaming and the subsequent professional fallout had clearly taken their toll. He was not here to support her. He was a moth drawn to the flame that had so badly burned him, compelled by some morbid curiosity to witness the final act of the drama he had so cruelly initiated. Perhaps he still harbored a desperate, pathetic hope that she would crack under the pressure, that the ghosts of her past would rise up and grant him some small, private victory in her public failure. Their eyes met for a single, charged second across the crowded hall. In his, she saw a flicker of disbelief that the waitress he'd tried to crush was truly here, on this stage, the center of this universe. In her own eyes, she let him see nothing but serene, unshakable peace. It was a non-verbal checkmate. The game was already over. Lysandra turned her back on him and everything he represented, giving her full attention to the magnificent Steinway concert grand and the waiting maestro. She gave Serrano a nod. He raised his baton. The opening chords of the concerto descended upon the hall. They were not just notes, they were the sound of despair, deep and resonant like the tolling of Russian funeral bells, evoking the oppressive weight of her lost years. Lysandra played them with a profound, solemn gravity, drawing every soul in the auditorium down into the darkness with her. Then against the melancholic backdrop of the strings, the piano began its ascent. The arpeggios were not a mere accompaniment. They were the sound of a determined heart beginning to beat again, a ripple of defiance spreading across a stagnant pool. The first movement was a tempest, a titanic struggle between shadow and light. Her performance was more than technically flawless. It was viscerally alive. The audience could hear the frantic fight for survival, the moments of near surrender, and the sheer, bloody-minded will to endure. Then came the sublime beauty of the adagio. The mood in the hall shifted. The frantic struggle gave way to a space of tender, breathtaking healing. This movement was a conversation with her ghosts, the good ones. As the flute and clarinet traded phrases with the piano, Lysandra was in dialogue with her memories. She played for her mother's restored health, for her father's unwavering belief, for Professor Markov's wisdom. Her touch on the keys was infinitely gentle, each note a perfect pearl of sound, a whisper of love and gratitude in the vast, silent hall. People in the audience wept without knowing why, moved by a beauty that spoke of forgiveness and the quiet dawn that follows the longest night. And then, the finale. The allegro scherzando erupted from the orchestra, and Lysandra's hands, which had been so tender moments before, became forces of nature. The music was a cathartic, joyous, defiant explosion. It was the sound of shackles shattering, of a spirit taking flight. Her fingers didn't just fly across the keys, they danced. They celebrated, they reveled in their freedom. This was not just Rachmaninoff's triumph. It was hers. It was the definitive answer to every doubt, every sneer, every moment of humiliation. It was the sound of a soul, once caged, now soaring in an infinite sky. As the final blazing chords of the concerto thundered through Carnegie Hall, uniting the full power of the piano and orchestra in a glorious, unequivocal statement of victory, the entire building seemed to vibrate with the sheer force of it. The last note hung in the air, a triumphant, shimmering echo, before being consumed by a profound, resonant silence. For a heartbeat, the audience was suspended, holding its collective breath. Then the hall exploded. The applause wasn't just loud, it was a physical eruption, a spontaneous, unified roar of admiration and emotional release. The entire audience, from the orchestra seats to the highest balcony, was on its feet, shouting, "Brava!" The orchestra members themselves were not immune. They joined in, tapping their bows against their music stands in the highest sign of respect a soloist can receive from their peers. Maestro Serrano, his face gleaming with sweat and pure elation, turned to Lysandra. He didn't just shake her hand. He grasped both of her shoulders, his grip firm, and leaned in close so only she could hear him over the din. "Tonight, Helena Whitlow," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you did not just play the music, you became it." Lysandra took her bows, the wave of sound a healing, wonderful force. The light on her face was not just from the stage lamps, but from a source deep within. As she looked out, she saw them not as judges, but as fellow travelers to whom she had just told her story. The ghost of the Van Cliburn and the man who had so cruelly invoked it were banished forever. During the intermission, the lobby buzzed with a single topic: the astonishing debut of Helena Whitlow. Jareth Hallberg, trying to slip out of the hall unnoticed, found himself trapped in the throng. It was then that Beatrice Ainsworth, looking regal and composed, stepped up to a small podium where a microphone had been placed. The excited chatter immediately hushed. "Tonight, we have witnessed the rebirth of a truly singular artist," Beatrice announced, her clear, calm voice amplified throughout the lobby. "And it has inspired us to ensure that no other talent is ever left to languish in the shadows due to hardship or the predatory whims of the powerful. I am therefore proud to announce the formal launch of the Markov Foundation for the Arts. Named in honor of Helena's late mentor, endowed with an initial $50 million to support gifted musicians who lack the resources to pursue their dreams." A wave of impressed murmurs went through the crowd. Beatrice paused, letting the news settle before she delivered the coup de grace, her eyes sweeping the room until they landed on the trapped figure of Jareth Hallberg. "This foundation is made possible by a consortium of dedicated patrons who believe art should be nurtured, not owned. It is a philosophy that has, regrettably, fallen out of favor with some. For instance, the Hallberg Foundation, once a significant name in arts philanthropy, was not invited to participate. We felt their vision was no longer aligned with the spirit of genuine artistic cultivation. It was a public execution, delivered with the serene elegance of a stiletto blade." Every head turned towards Hallberg. The whispers that followed were merciless. He stood frozen, his face ashen, as the invisible walls of the world he had once ruled closed in around him. He was no longer just a failed bully, he was a pariah, a cautionary tale, publicly and permanently exiled. His reckoning was absolute. This story isn't just about the magic of music, it's a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Lysandra Whitlow's journey reminds us that our past failures do not have to define our future. It shows that true power isn't found in wealth or status, but in the courage to own our voice and share our unique gifts with the world, even when we're terrified. It's a story of how one person's dignity and talent, when finally unleashed, can topple an empire of arrogance and cruelty. It proves that kindness and genuine support, like that from Beatrice Ainsworth, are the forces that can truly change a life. If this story of triumph over adversity moved you and reminded you of the strength that lies within us all, please take a moment to hit that like button to help us share it with more people. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder of their own power And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that inspire and empower. What part of Lysandra's journey resonated with you the most? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for listening.